Hello, and welcome to the final week of the BYFI seminar Beyond Tikkun Olam. So, in the past few weeks, we've done a very quick tour through a few movements in which Jews have been deeply involved, movements that Jews have both shaped and been shaped by. We've talked about the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and the women's movement. And of course, there are so many other movements that we could have covered. There's Zionism, peace and anti war activism, LGBT activism, Soviet Jewry, environmentalism, genocide in Darfur, immigration reform, Occupy Wall Street. There's so many places where we see Jews' involvement and where we could connect it to issues of Jewish tradition and history and identity. And when we kind of survey the contemporary scene, we see that Jews remain very involved in general social movements and also have been very active in creating specifically Jewishly identified organizations to do this kind of work. I would argue that the history of Jews and activism remains really relevant in the 21st century, in large part because it plays an increasingly big role in how American Jews understand what it means to be Jewish. If we look at the recent Pew survey of American Jews, it found that more than 56% believe that engaging in social justice is essential to Jewish identity. That is more than 3 times as many as those who say that ritual practice is essential to Jewish identity. I would also point out that as Jewish practice has become more eclectic, there are new ways of combining religious practice and politics. So, whereas in the 20th century, particularly in the beginning of the 20th century, there were sort of separate categories of secular politics and religious ritual as vehicles for expressing Jewish identity. Today, there's much more movement between the two and connections between the two. So, for example, to bring us back to one of the primary sources that we looked at the first week, the ad for the Yom Kippur picnic, and contrast that with images of Jews at Occupy Wall Street. In some ways, they're similar kinds of radical protests, even happening in a similar place. But whereas the Yom Kippur picnic was blatantly rejecting the practice of Yom Kippur commemoration by hosting a picnic instead of a fast, Jews at Occupy Wall Street held a Kol Nidre service. They held other services where they brought the Torah. The Occupy protest in Boston had a Sukkah during Sukkot, and I'm sure that was the case elsewhere as well. So we see both continuities and changes in the way that American Jews do their activism and how they identify it as Jewish or not. One of the important changes in Jewish activism that we talked about a little bit in the last week or two is the shift in role in terms of both self-interest and benefit. So if Jews were once politicized in large part because of self-interest, they were the beneficiaries of the social movements that they were involved in. Now Jews tend to be more involved and allies. This is not to say that there isn't an understanding that improving the world benefits everyone, but Jews aren't necessarily the direct beneficiaries anymore of the work that we're doing. So this causes some important changes in how we articulate our motivations and our role in social movements. And I think that that's a topic that really requires a lot of exploration and articulation in the 21st century. I think also when we look at issues of universalism and particularism, this is another place where we see both continuities and differences as we cross from the 20th century into the 21st century. In the case of earlier generations of activists, we saw that activism offered a way to connect to universal ideas while also remaining connected to one's particularist tradition. So, for example, being part of a Jewish labor movement was a way to be involved in a kind of movement to change the world more broadly, but to do it with a Jewish flavor and with a Jewish community and to exercise that as part of one's Jewish practice. I think that today one of the challenges that is posed by the identification of social justice as part of what it means to quote-unquote do Jewish is the tendency to then identify these universal values as somehow Jewish values. And I often hear these conversations within Jewish social justice education and activism about reminding ourselves that we do not own social justice, that those are not Jewish values alone, and how do we talk about those as Jewish values but also acknowledge that we don't have any kind of they're not proprietary ideas of the Jewish tradition. I think also that if we look at some of the ways that Jews have connected to the activist tradition as part of our history, as part of our religious tradition, as part of our identity expression, in the 21st century, the connections to history and tradition are fairly broad. We know there's a history, but in general, the way we talk about it is not very nuanced, just sort of making reference to it. We know that there's a tradition, but it's been reduced to a very general kind of call for tikkun olam. And as I've said, the identity piece is increasingly important in terms of how Jews understand what it means to be Jewish in the world. Um, and this is part of why I do the work that I do. I believe that if we don't have a more complex and deeply explored understanding of the tradition and the history pieces, then that identity piece is going to result as something that is less rooted and less meaningful and therefore can't have as much of a hold on people. So I hope that the conversation that we'll be able to have this week will begin to draw on some of those connections and talk about them in terms of our own lives and in the things that we're involved in and what we see happening around us in both the Jewish world and in the world of social change. I've given you a few different readings to look at this week. One, the secondary source is an article by Rabbi Jill Jacobs in which she talks about 3 generations of Jewish women activists in each of the movements that we've talked about. So I thought that that would be a nice way to kind of pull together some of the specific movements we've talked about in this seminar. In terms of the primary sources, I've given you links to a bunch of contemporary Jewish social justice organizations, and I'd like you to look at the ways that the American Jewish community today frames its relationship to social justice and social change, the kind of language that is used, the way that values are talked about, the way that intended impact is talked about. I've also given you 2 other articles from 2012. One is an article from the Jewish journal Zeek about the Jewish social justice agenda, and the other is an article from a San Francisco newspaper about a controversy in the Bay Area Jewish community about whether a panel on reclaiming Jewish activism could include somebody who's involved in the BDS movement, the movement for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. So that is another place where we can talk about where the boundaries are for what is considered Jewish activism and where the legacy of Jewish activism can be deployed. I'm looking forward to our conversation this week, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week. Thank you.